The Vox had gone silent long before the screaming stopped. Even among the dunes of Baal's shattered outer moons, that silence felt deeper than vacuum. It was not the absence of noise, but the end of testimony. When Zephon fell, he did so without cry or call, the transmission cut mid-syllable by a Xenos blade forged to sever futures, not flesh. A weapon like a whisper through plasteel, curved along a geometry too perfect to belong to man, or even Astartes. In that single moment, a dominion of the 9th Legion was unmade. Not dead, but unspoken. He had not earned such an end. Before the cut, Zephon had been a figure of reverence within the Legion, both destroyer and designer, tactician and artisan. Among the Blood Angels, art was not ornament, it was doctrine. Every campaign was a canvas, every blade a chisel. But what Zephon sculpted best was silence. His kill ratio during the Acheron compliance was spoken of like sacrament. He did not command loyalty, he radiated it. When his body was found, fused with sand and armoured ruin, he still clutched the haft of his glaive, fingers locked in death rigor, as if refusing the blade's betrayal. Apothecaries could not recall how he lived long enough to be extracted. What little remained of his torso had been cauterized by alien tech. Arteries sealed with surgical malice, not mercy. His spine was shattered in 7 places. His vocal cords were partially dissected, not severed, as though the Xenos had wanted him alive, but unheard. The Legion, then at the apex of its glory, reacted not with mourning, but with ritual. His name was not sung. His deeds were not archived. There was no pyre on Baal Secundus, no purity seal left to curl in solar wind. To survive in such a state was not miracle, it was violation. Maimed, unwhole, and bereft of function, Zephon was placed in stasis not to preserve, but to forget. The Twiceborn was first silenced by a Xenos weapon. He would be silenced again by his own kin. The silence stretched for years. The Horus heresy had not yet fully opened its wound, and yet Zephon's exile prefigured its shape. Betrayal without name, survival without meaning. Deep within the apothecarian vaults, where even chaplains did not walk, he slept, half metal, half ghost. What was left of his organs had been supplemented with rudimentary cybernetics by field surgeons who neither understood nor cared for artistry. The angels had no songs for the broken. It was not Sanguinius who called for his restoration. It was not any of his battle brothers. The order came in cipher, marked by the sigil of terror and carried by agents who wore no colours. Within the transmission was a single name: Malcador. Zephon's stasis pod was extracted without pageantry and without witness. Not even the Reclusiarch was informed. He vanished from the vaults as easily as he had once vanished from the battlefield. When he awoke, it was not to the golden light of the Ninth's amphitheatres or the red dusk of Baal's open ranges. It was the void, cold, black, with the mechanical ache of new limbs bolted to old bones. The Martian priesthood had rebuilt him, but not as a warrior. His form was a prototype, a study in pain thresholds and cybernetic rejection. The flesh screamed even when he did not. He was given a name by his Mechanicum handlers, Subject Zephon 9, a designation, not a title. They did not know who he had been, or if they did, they no longer cared. For months, he was tested, reflexes measured, neural feedback recorded. They asked him of dreams. They inquired about visions. They never once mentioned the Legion. He did not volunteer. He had been beautiful once, a symbol of poise in a brotherhood of savagery. Now he was function over form, efficiency over elegance. His once graceful movements replaced with mechanical stutter. His voice returned, but his silence remained. Then came the summons. Not from Baal, not from any known theatre of war, but from beneath terror itself. The Webway War, still secret, still denied by the Sigillites' mouthpieces, had begun to turn. Custodians were dying. Sisters of Silence were vanishing. Demons stalked tunnels not mapped by mortal hand. The Crusader host was being formed. Volunteers, outcasts, and those whose deaths would not destabilize command structures. Zephon was among the first chosen. He did not ask why, he did not object. In his mind, there was no return to Baal. Not as he was. He had bled among the angels, and they had sealed the wound with silence. The offer of war was not redemption, it was relevance. In the black tunnels of the Webway, identity was a liability. There were no colours, no legions, just targets. And Zephon, reborn in metal and void, would make himself heard once more. It was there, beneath the surface of the throne world, that he began to earn back not respect, but myth. He moved without hesitation. His kills were silent, swift. He never spoke unless asked. But the others began to mark his presence. The way his movement slowed just before a demonic ambush. The way his sword never sang, but always struck. They began to call him the bringer of sorrow, not for what he did, but for what they saw in him. He never confirmed the name. He never denied it. But among the mongrel ranks, those unfit for parade or archive, he became a ghost they followed. And when they spoke of his eyes, they did not mention optics or enhancements. They spoke of something older, something buried, something left unsaid on the sands of Baal. There were statues on Baal that bore his signature, none with name, all with presence. Before the blade took him, before the mechanicum broke him further, Zephon had not only led the charge into silence, he had sculpted meaning from blood. He'd forged iconography that lingered across the phalanxes of the 9th Legion, the asymmetrical flourish of a death mask's cheek plate, the tortured curve of an archangel's wings on the hilt of a power blade, the quiet tension in the face of a martyr immortalized above a chapel's altar. Not symbols, wounds, fixed in alloy and stone. Among the Blood Angels, art was not separate from war. The Legion's gene mark, the flaw they all denied but carried, festered in them as reverence for form. War was a stage, and they performed it with manic grace, choreographing carnage in spirals of death too precise to be mistaken for instinct. Zephon, however, did not perform. He mourned. Every strike he delivered on the battlefield was a lamentation. Every sculpture he left in the forges beneath Baal Secundus was a monument to something already lost. He was never loud. Others led the choir, he carved its silence. His peers among the Dominion spoke of duty, of compliance rates, of glory. Zephon spoke only in shapes. He'd once crafted a miniature of Sanguinius, not the winged deity as the Legion knew him, but the father as seen in half shadow, weary and wounded, with one wing folded and the other scorched. It was destroyed by a chaplain who deemed it heretical. Zephon never sculpted his father again. When the Xenos blade took his body, it did more than remove him from command. It amputated his place in the pattern. He was returned not just broken, but alien to the forms he once venerated. His hands, now metal, had no memory of the pressure required to etch marble. His optic augmetics read curvature in decimals and grain in sub-angstroms, but felt nothing. He could replicate art with technical precision. But replication was desecration. Zephon did not recreate. He bled into matter. Now there was no blood. Only code and pressure feedback. Arkan Land, who would later walk beside him on Terra's walls, remarked that Zephon possessed the aesthetic neurosis of a failed musician. But he misunderstood. It was not failure. It was grief. The loss of touch was not inconvenience. It was identity collapse. When Zephon stood in the Mechanicum's fabrication bays, surrounded by alloy, servo arms and assembly matrices, he did not feel possibility. He felt exile. He tried once to shape a bust in silent solitude, not of Sanguinius, not of any Primarch, of nothing. It was a face that bore no features, a gesture toward memory, a prayer for something that no longer spoke. His hands trembled, not from damage, but from the rejection of intention. The alloy cracked under his own pressure. He left the shards where they fell. The artisans of the 9th, who once looked to him for inspiration, had moved on. Their gallery shrines no longer bore his stylings. The curvature of helms had returned to symmetry. The asymmetry he once championed, meant to reflect imbalance, inner contradiction, the lie of perfection, was now seen as contamination. Even the aesthetics of pain had to be reprocessed, sterilized. Zephon had no place in this choir anymore. He was the dissonant chord, not tragic, disruptive. He stopped sculpting. Instead, he watched. On Terra, beneath the golden arcologies, he found the memory of form in motion. The custodians moved like statues unchained. Not art, not grace, intention. Every turn, every strike, every pivot of their halberds was devoid of performance. They did not seek to appear beautiful. They were not aware of their impact. They simply were. He observed them in silence and saw, for the first time since Baal, a form of expression not built to be seen. He envied them. But among the mongrel ranks, sisters discarded from the silent orders, remnant tech adepts fallen from favor, Astartes who bore no legion heraldry, he discovered something rawer. They bled without artifice. They fought without rhythm. There were no hymns sung for their kills, no murals drawn for their dead. They did not perform death. They endured it. And in them, Zephon found a new canvas. He began repairing their gear, not out of duty, but precision, adjusting grip triggers, reinforcing vambrace tension springs. He modified one warrior's exoskeletal frame to counterbalance a spinal deformity acquired from warp exposure. When asked why, he said nothing. But the others began to leave their gear near him during rest cycles, never requesting, just placing, and always in silence. They had begun to understand his medium. Zephon did not speak of his past. The name Blood Angel was never uttered. But the way he wrapped a broken blade in cloth before returning it, or the way he repositioned a helmet's optics to allow for peripheral enhancement at the cost of target isolation, these were acts of sculpture. He had found a way to shape again. Not monuments, not legends, survivors. When Malcador came to inspect the Crusader host, he passed Zephon without remark. Whether this was by design or dismissal, no one could say. But the sigillite's eyes lingered on a crude engraving burned into the side of a boarding shield, half glyph, half scar. Not elegant, not symmetrical, but deliberate. He did not ask who made it. That night, Zephon did not sleep. Not from pain, not from stimulation, but from memory. He knelt alone in a cooling vent chamber, where the Mechanicum dumped waste heat from its deeper furnaces. There, in the hum of failing fans, he etched a line into the wall, not words, not runes, just a stroke, jagged, tilted, asymmetrical. It would mean nothing to any who saw it, but to him, it was the shape of a scream denied. He never sculpted again. Not with stone, not with plasteel. From then on, he sculpted only in motion. The Martian limbs were not made to fit a soul. The bionics were state-of-the-art by Adeptus Mechanicus standards, but that was never the standard Zephon had lived by. Their precision was cold. Their logic was absolute. Their form was indifferent. He had once shaped beauty with his hands. Now those hands terminated in actuated digits of red steel, sensor-threaded and reinforced, but dead in every way that mattered. No pulse, no tension, no memory of warmth. He could crush a stone into dust with one flex of his augmetic fist, but he could not feel the texture of the grit that fell from his grip. They told him it was a gift, a second life. They used phrases like functionality restored and combat viability re-established. He did not correct them. What purpose would it serve? They had reassembled a weapon from the ruins of a man, not to honor what had been lost, but to prove the Forge's supremacy over the flesh. Their triumph was not his resurrection, it was their dominion. His voice, returned through layered modulation in a synthetic larynx, carried none of its former music. When he spoke, it was not the intonation of a blood angel. It was a machine that remembered what it had once meant to sound like one. And so he rarely spoke. There was no poetry in distortion. The custodians he fought beside did not comment. They did not need to. They knew he was not one of them. He did not carry the same scent of divinity, the same calibration of motion. He was efficient, not elegant, unbroken, but visibly reforged. To them, he was a tool of use, nothing more, nothing less. Their silence was not judgment, it was classification. Among the mortal auxilia, his presence became a paradox. They feared him, as all mortals fear things made for war, but they also watched him with something like reverence. Not because of what he was, because of what he wasn't. He did not bleed, he did not pray, he did not sleep. He fought, and when the fighting ended, he repaired things. His own gear, theirs. Vicious in battle, quiet in rest. They called him Dominion, though none knew what the title meant. Only that it had weight. He never corrected them. When asked to lead, he did so with no rhetoric. He pointed. He moved. Others followed. There was no glory in his orders, only clarity. Under his direction, strike teams operated like blades plunged without flourish. Their kill rates increased. Their losses stabilized. No one celebrated. There was no cohesion, only effect. But it was enough for the war beneath the palace. The Webway campaign did not permit honorifics. It devoured them. No brotherhoods, no banners. Only corridors that bled, demons that lied in scent and form, and the slow corrosion of will. Most soldiers assigned to the lower reaches lasted a week before psychic exposure rendered them mute or screaming. Zephon never faltered, not because he was brave, because he was already severed from the voices that could be taken. There were moments, however, flashes in his ocular feed, when he would catch reflections in the warplate of those he fought beside. Not demons, not horrors, himself, but misaligned, refracted, as if the angle revealed not who he was, but who he had been. One such moment occurred in the aftermath of the Vault Massacre, when the gene thief demons of the Pale Cohort had assumed the forms of fallen Astartes and lured a whole platoon into ritual slaughter. Zephon arrived too late to prevent the deaths, but not too late to exact consequence. He purged the vault with blade and flame, his sword humming with overcharged energy. He did not speak. He did not scream. He moved with the rhythm of grief unending. The survivors watched him reduce the false angels to cinders, and in one of them, a medici sergeant named Venya, a question was spoken aloud that none had dared voice before. "What do you see when you kill them?" Zephon turned. The green glow of his eye lenses caught her face. He said nothing, but after a long pause he looked away. "Less," he said. It was the only word he offered. He left the vault without looking back. Later, during repair cycles, he modified his armor to remove the rank sigils on his pauldrons, not to hide, to empty. He was no longer Dominion. He was not Exarch. He was not of the High Host. These were constructs built atop memory, and memory had no power in the dark. There were still those who tried to raise him. A sister of silence once approached him in a silent corridor, her fingers tracing a symbol in the dust, a rune from the angelic cant, known only to those who had walked among the ninth. He did not respond. He walked past her. She left the mark there, but it was erased by the footfalls of others before the hour ended. The irony was cruel. He had been made iron to endure, but endurance was not life. It was repetition, function without freedom. When the custodians came to him with a modified power glaive, the first weapon crafted specifically for his new strength, he held it for 17 minutes before speaking. "This blade will not fail," they said. "It isn't the blade that failed," he replied. They did not ask what he meant. Zephon carried that weapon into the Black Spires, where the fabric of reality warped and time collapsed into loops. There, in halls where the Emperor's psychic breath still lingered as burning echo, he fought creatures that remembered his face from other wars that had not yet happened. They called him names in dead dialects. Some begged for mercy. Others mocked the silence that followed him. He answered with steel. Not vengeance, not wrath, just finality. The archives recorded 34 confirmed demon kills. The logs do not mention the way he paused afterward, the way he stared at the blade in his hand, as if unsure whether it had been the weapon, or himself, that had become the instrument. In the depths of terror, where silence became absolute and memory dissolved into static, Zephon came to understand the truth of what the Mechanicum had done. They had not saved him. They had isolated him. From pain, from connection, from meaning, not for cruelty, for utility. He was reforged not as penance nor as promise. He was reforged because he was still useful. And usefulness, in the eyes of the Martian Creed, was the only form of immortality that mattered. There are no records of the Webway War's total dead. The corridors beneath terror devoured memory along with life. Vox signals bled into static. Auspex returns painted hallucinations. What orders were given dissolved before they reached their destination. The crusade fought in those tunnels was not a war of banners or battle lines. It was attrition shaped like madness. And within that silence, Zephon moved. He was not the first of the Astartes to serve in the unspoken host, nor was he the most celebrated, but he was the most constant. Others broke, some fell, some were lost entirely, absorbed by the labyrinthine folds of unreal space. Zephon endured, not because he was guided, because he was already lost. He never referred to his time among the Blood Angels, not once. He wore no red, carried no heraldry. He fought beside warriors who bore markings from dozens of legions, but none acknowledged their origins. To do so was to invite death, or worse, recognition. The demons that hunted them fed on stories. Names gave them power. Identity was leverage. In the Webway, anonymity was survival. Still, patterns formed. Those who endured gravitated to one another, not in fellowship, but frequency. They shared no barracks. They did not train together. They simply survived in overlapping spheres. Zephon was one such nexus. Not a leader, a constant, an anchor around which others began to orbit. Among them was a former scion of the Stormwalkers, once known for his tempestuous fury, now silent and skeletal, half his skull replaced with Flenser augmetics. Another was a psyker whose name had been burned out by the Sisterhood, leaving only a blank slate of vengeance and a melted icon where her Vox implant had been. These were not allies. They were proximity ghosts. Survivors who happened to remain alive when others died screaming. They began to refer to themselves, never aloud, as the Mongrel Court. Zephon did not name them, but he did not reject them either. He shared rations without being asked, covered retreats without being ordered, repaired gear without seeking thanks. He was not trying to lead. He was not trying to serve. He was sculpting, again, this time with death as his medium. Their kill teams grew more efficient. Not due to coordination, but coherence. A brutal kind of intuition began to form. Each knew how the others moved, how they fought, how they broke. Patterns of breath, angles of swing. Even the blood spatter arcs began to fall in familiar shapes. They were not a warband. They were a bleed pattern. Zephon's actions drew attention. From the custodians, number from Malcador. The sigillite did not speak to him. He passed him once in the depth gate, where the atmosphere collapsed every 20 cycles, and time skipped like a damaged reel. Zephon stood amid a pile of severed limbs, none human, and the sigillite merely looked at him. Whatever passed between them, it was not exchange. It was recognition. After that, Zephon found his assignments shifting. No longer was he dispatched to random fronts. Now his team, the Mongrel Court, though the name was never officially recorded, was deployed to critical junctures. Rift nodes, data nexus points, bridgeways between stable Webway channels, and ruptures still bleeding unreality. At first they assumed it was coincidence. Then came the patterns. The targets weren't demons, they were data cores. Specifically, cogitator hives once part of the old Night networks, now partially absorbed into the Imperial Webway expansion. These were sites of ancient knowledge, half digested by the machine cult, now leaking into the real with hazardous latency. The demons weren't guarding them. They were drawn to them, like insects to open wounds. Zephon understood before the rest. The war was not only against the demons, it was against the past. Malcador was purging knowledge, ripping out roots of understanding buried too deep in the lattice. These cores contained fragments of history not sanctioned for remembrance, genetic codes, pre-unity protocols, names of legions that no longer existed, images of Primarchs now erased, secrets that, if reawakened, could destabilize not just terror, but memory itself. The mongrel court became executioners, not of flesh, of knowledge. Zephon obeyed, not because he believed, because he remembered. When he had sculpted on Baal, every piece began with memory, not detail, feeling, an impression of presence rendered in form, the past shaped into resonance. What Malcador was doing, what he was making Zephon do, was the opposite. He was obliterating resonance, removing form, not erasing events, erasing the idea that they had ever mattered. In one node, designated Vault Tertius 9, they encountered something that should not have survived. A statue of Zephon, but not as he was, as he had been. The face, unbroken. The armor, unmarred. The wings, not literal but sculpted into his shadow, reached toward a halo that did not exist. The plaque read only, "Bringer of Sorrow." He did not hesitate. He reduced it to powder with a single strike. He did not speak of it to the others. But afterward, in the quiet between assignments, he dismantled his glaive. Not to destroy, to reforge, he altered its counterweight, reshaped the edge. He removed the purity seal etched into its core. Not because it was impure, because it was memory. He would not carry memory into this war, only function, only silence, only blood in the code. The siege did not begin with bombardment. It began with hunger, not for flesh, but for meaning. As the walls of terror shuddered and the heavens fractured under the weight of rebellion, those who descended into the blood-wet hollows of the inner defenses did not ask why. They simply moved, like tide, like echo, like fracture. Zephon was among them. He came to Saturnine not as a son of Sanguinius, nor as a herald of any legion. His warplate bore no mark. His name appeared on no deployment manifest. He was a shadow walking behind permission. Those who knew him by sight called him Dominion still, though few knew why. His silence answered most questions before they could be asked. What remained of the mongrel court had dwindled. Warpburn, misfire, sabotage, terror claimed them in pieces. Those who survived were scattered across kill boxes and null zones, redirected, reassigned, dissolved. Zephon fought alone now, not for secrecy, for necessity. No one could survive long at his side. His presence was terminal. He entered Saturnine Wall through breach vector 92 Chen, where the sons of Horus had made first incision. The interior was a tangle of steel arteries and shrine mechanisms, most already defiled. Mechanicum units were reduced to their servo spines. Data priests hung from filament nooses, cogitator nodes still blinking for instructions that would never come. The wall did not resist. It endured. That was its function. Zephon matched it. The enemy was not chaos in the crude sense, not horns and fire, not demonic ecstasy. The foe here was patience. The Justarin hunted with surgical cruelty. Warriors of the War Master who remembered loyalty like a toxin in the blood. They moved with intent, not frenzy. They killed like artists, their cruelty precise. For the first time since the Webway, Zephon felt recognition, not of kinship, of form. He killed 3 Justarin in silence, their armor crumpling beneath optimized strikes. Each motion was committed without excess, no spin, no flourish. He did not speak their names, even when they screamed his. They remembered him, somehow, from before, from Baal, from the outer marches, from whispered data they were never meant to receive. It did not matter. Recognition had no power here. Saturnine was not a battlefield. It was a crucible of exhaustion. The wounded outnumbered the able. Vox channels stuttered beneath psychic interference. The palace did not command. it endured as well. Orders came broken. Coordinates were fluid. Allies were strangers. Zephon adapted. He did not need clarity, only contact. On the third day, he found himself pinned behind a shattered reliquary wall, supporting the weight of a dying sister of silence. Her vocal cords had been burned out long before the battle, but her eyes spoke with the violence of doctrine. She bled from 8 points. Her blade was broken. Still, she had stood between a warp-possessed word-bearer and the last exit shaft of a strategic corridor. She had held the line. Zephon arrived too late to save her. He did not speak. She did not breathe. He took her blade's hilt and affixed it to his belt, not as trophy, as charge. Later that cycle, he wielded it to kill the demon host that had slaughtered her squad. The blade cracked on contact. The demon laughed. Zephon did not. He cut again, this time with his own edge. No words, no prayer, just completion. It was during this phase, fractured, blurred, dripping with static, that the name returned. Bringer of Sorrow. It came from behind him, through vox static saturated with screams. The voice was not one he knew. A mortal. Civilian, maybe. Someone hiding, someone watching. The phrase came again, filtered through layers of terror and awe. The bringer of sorrow walks the breach. It spread, faster than he moved, faster than he could silence. Servitors repeated it on loop. Mortals scrawled it in ash and oil. Astartes he did not know nodded as he passed, not in salute, in fear, in need. He became symbol again, but not by will. He was seen as inevitability. Where he walked, death followed, not of the enemy, but of hope, not defeat, acceptance, that the end had come, and he was only its messenger. Zephon tried to vanish. He rerouted away from populated tunnels, took the low paths, the vent zones, the organ shafts beneath the liturgical transmission spires. But word still spread. In one instance, a squad of Terran conscripts refused to retreat from a doomed choke point. They believed he would come, that if they stood long enough, the bringer would arrive. They were right. He did. But only in time to burn their corpses before the plague could spread. He did not mourn. But afterward, he carved a mark into the wall with a bent servo shiv. Not a name, not a sigil, just a wound. Toward the final day of the Saturnine breach, Zephon stood alone at Node 13-7 Kappa. No reinforcements, no orders. Just a corridor that bent time and light, where the demons of the floor walked in flesh borrowed from fallen suns. Some wore his face, others wore Sanguinius. One wore the mask of a sculpture he had destroyed long ago. He killed them all, not with rage, with certainty. The corridor was collapsed behind him by a micro-detonation he placed himself. He did not check for survivors. There were none. There was only memory. And dust. The breach was sealed, Saturnine held. But afterward, in the command logs of that sector, no name was listed for the one who led the final purge. Only a title, Bringer of Sorrow. No one could agree where it came from, but none denied he had earned it. There are echoes that do not fade, not in sound, but in presence. Zephon walked through them long after the siege broke open, long after the palace bled into myth. Terror had not healed. It had ossified, its scars preserved, not repaired. The war was not over. It had simply moved out of reach. But beneath the crust of that victory, the silence still moved with him. He did not rejoin the Ninth. No emissary came from Baal. No summons from Sanguinius. The Legion had closed around itself like a wound that chose not to scar. Zephon had become unacceptable, neither martyr nor hero. His survival was an aberration, his form a denial. The others who bore the Legion's blood now whispered of him with caution, like a prophecy they feared they had ignored. He walked the post-war corridors of the inner palace as a ghost in red armor that bore no chapter, no mark. Those who saw him moved aside, not from fear, from discomfort. He did not belong to the triumph. He was not part of any remembrancer's tally. Statues were raised across the throne world in the years that followed, golden visages of the fallen, rendered in reverent excess. None bore his likeness, none bore his name. But in the crypt corridors beneath the memorial arcologies, someone had carved a line into a pillar. He did not speak. He ended things. No signature, no context, just the words. By then, Zephon had already left the surface. He did not retire. He did not seek peace. He moved downward, into the systems beneath the systems, where the Webway still festered and the warp-touched strata of terror bled into catacombs unnamed. There, the remnants of the Crusader host still lingered, muted, modified, half-human shapes that had outlived their purpose. Among them, he was more legend than living. Some called him the Twice-Born, others, the One Who Saw. No two stories matched. One said he had walked with the Emperor. Another claimed he had died 5 times and been denied the Black Rage each time. Another still swore he could speak to the dead through his augmetics. Zephon corrected none of them. Myth was armor. He let it spread. But not all myths are safe. Whispers began to surface among the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. Psychers in the deep vaults spoke of a presence that moved without signature. A figure in red that walked void corridors where no gravity held, whose shadow burned in dream space like a failed communion. They called it the Bringer, not with reverence, with dread. It was during a purge of the unspoken depths, a classified campaign no charted division ever acknowledged, that Zephon re-emerged in official record. A team of 20 death cult assassins and 6 null-bonded Ogryns were dispatched to cleanse a warp-breached zone in the foundation stratum of the Imperial dungeon. Only one returned. Her statement, archived in a restricted chamber, read as follows: "It wasn't a demon. It wasn't a man. It was a silence that moved. It had eyes like a wound. We didn't kill it. It let us leave." There is no notation on who ordered her execution afterward, only that her file was erased. Zephon did not seek conflict, but conflict found him. Wherever forbidden knowledge resurfaced, wherever a lost vault stuttered open, wherever failed Primarch experiments or buried pre-Unity relics clawed toward light, the red figure arrived. Unmarked, unrecorded, consistent. He did not deliver sermons, he ended cycles. Over decades, a name began to circulate in hushed circles within the Inquisition. Not as target, as threshold. If the Bringer of Sorrow arrives, the matter is closed. In the Codicium Obscura, his name appears once. No image, no sigil, just a phrase. Entity designation Zephon, functionally reclassified as Instrument Class Vector. No compliance necessary. Termination unnecessary. Deployment autonomous. There is no record of who authorized this, but the Mechanicus began to take notice. His augmetics, once considered crude by the standards of Mars, had changed. They were no longer standard issue, no longer reproducible. They adapted, shifted, grew. Internal data looms in the red vaults suggested his bionics were now partially self-designing, rewriting feedback loops to align with neural trauma patterns. Not mutation, symbiosis. He had become a closed system, a body that rejected legacy, a mind that refused origin, a presence that could not be co-opted, not by chapter, not by forge, not by throne. It was then, in the quiet phase between crusades and reforms, that a missive appeared in the Strategium of Baal. No sender, no encryption, just a fragment of verse from an ancient Legion chant. Blood remembers shape, even when the sculptor is gone. No one claimed to understand it, but a minor successor. Chapter, formed in silence and sanctioned only under the aegis of spiritual deviation, began to stir. They called themselves the Charnel Guard. No parentage was declared, no progenitor named. Only a crimson pauldron bearing a glyph, an asymmetrical wound, drawn as if by hand. And in the records of their founding, no name appears under Chapter Master. But among the Guard themselves, one name is never spoken, only remembered, not as command, as grief. There was no ceremony, no torchlit rite, no roar of acceptance from the heavens. The Charnel Guard did not emerge like other chapters, sculpted from the gene seed of a known sire, weighed and measured beneath the gaze of the High Lords, sanctioned by Terran decree. They formed like a scar, quietly, painfully, inevitable. The dates are deliberately blurred. The founding is attributed to the so-called Silent Wave, a period in which several chapters were created under obscured authorization following the second founding, using non-standard processes. Some histories place them as a Blood Angel successor. Others argue their gene seed is chimeric, drawn from battle-broken reserves held in secret by the Mechanicus or dredged from lost vaults beneath Terra itself. What is clear is that the Guard did not ask for recognition. They appeared, armed, armoured, structured in ways that did not match Astartes' doctrine, but functioned all the same. They did not recruit in the traditional manner. They did not draw from aspirant worlds. They took from war zones, those left behind, those discarded, those presumed dead, broken scouts, failed initiates, prisoners of forgotten campaigns. They did not test for strength. They tested for silence, for refusal to yield to memory. The Charnel Guard did not want warriors who dreamed of glory. They wanted survivors who had lost everything sacred and kept walking anyway. Their fortress monastery is not listed on any cartograph. It is not located on Bel, nor anywhere near it. The few who have glimpsed it and lived describe a structure more like a mausoleum than a bastion, constructed in orbit around a dead star, the void field permanently bent by the gravity well of its own absence. The fortress has no name. It is referred to only as the Threshold. Within it, no banners fly, no iconography marks the halls, only fragments, chipped frescoes, broken helms, scraps of unpainted ceramite bolted into the walls, relics not of victory, but of loss. The Charnel Guard does not celebrate campaigns. They preserve aftermaths. Their librarium is not a record of triumph, but a catalogue of what was never recovered. Their gene seed is stable, but only barely. The red thirst manifests early, within days of implantation. The black rage appears before the neophyte has ever seen battle. Most should not survive it, but those who do are changed. The apothecarian does not purge the afflicted. It binds them, not with drugs, with ritual. Charnel Guard neophytes are buried alive in obsidian coffins for 7 days upon receiving the gene seed. They are not fed, not prayed over. They are left to scream in the dark. Those who emerge are permitted to bear the mark. The mark is not a blood drop, it is a wound, drawn by hand, different each time, asymmetrical. The Guard does not wear uniform livery. Armour is unpainted save for a single gauntlet stained red. Some bear bone-coloured helmets, others black. There is no consistency, only function. The only shared trait is the pauldron bearing the wound mark, sometimes carved, sometimes branded, sometimes burned with acid. There is no regulation, there is only permanence. Their combat doctrine is contradictory by Imperial standards. They favour sudden decapitation strikes, often without warning, vox clearance, or orbital coordination. They refuse to hold territory, preferring to erase enemy command structure and vanish before counter-assault. They do not deploy banners. They do not broadcast heraldry. They do not send mission reports. Their dead are never recovered. Their victories are rarely acknowledged, but they succeed. They are sent into war zones marked irrecoverable. They arrive without request. They do not speak to planetary governors. They do not interface with Astra Militarum Command. They appear. They act. They leave. Entire wars are known to have turned due to their presence, yet they claim no credit. In some records, their actions are attributed to unknown forces. The Administratum refers to them, quietly, as disavowed asset Theta 7. Only one voice ever named them plainly. In the vaults of Baal, an old transmission was once logged but never decrypted. A fragment, corrupted. Voice print unverified, but believed, by some, to belong to Zephon himself. The transmission contained only 4 words, "They remember what hurts." No further contact followed. The Charnel Guard does not recruit from Baal. They do not answer the summons of the Blood Angels. Yet when the devastation of Baal occurred, they appeared, without heralds, without plea. They landed in drop capsules marked only with charred pictographs of weeping angels. They fought where the flesh-tearers refused. They held where the sky bled. They never spoke. And when the tide turned, they left before the dust settled. None asked why. None dared. To this day, their allegiance is debated. Some believe them to be a sanctioned punishment, a legion of grief forged to remind the Ninth of what they abandoned. Others believe they are rogue elements, a proto-chapter gone feral in ritual and mind. Still others suggest they are the broken dreams of a dominion who once walked among artists, whose hands were taken, whose voice was stilled, and who chose to sculpt a new form not in stone, but in war. They are not beloved, they are not trusted, they are not understood, but they are never late, and they are never undone. There is no record of what Zephon called himself after the heresy. The titles died one by one: Dominion, Exile, Twice-Born, Exarch of the High Host, until all that remained was silence, not absence, not denial. A deliberate refusal to echo what had already been lost. In the crypt language of the Charnel Guard, this silence became a symbol, not a blank space, a wound without a border, a mark without inscription. When the Charnel Guard moved, they moved with that silence. It preceded them, not as stealth, as gravity. Vox channels failed in their presence. Mortal voices cracked. Even other Astartes reported hearing static in their minds, like something unfinished was whispering through the seams of their helmets. It was not psychic by librarian standards. It was not demonic. It could not be traced. But wherever the Guard deployed, that pressure, unseen, unmeasured, settled first. It came to be known as the absence field. An inquisitorial probe into this anomaly, led by Ordo Astartes savant militant Lan, yielded only one definitive statement. The Charnel Guard are not silent. They carry silence with them, as a contagion, as a structure, as a weapon. Lan's vessel later disappeared during warp transit. The report remains unfiled. No war chant is known to exist within the chapter. No battle cry has ever been recorded. What sound they make in battle is unclear. Some claim they emit frequencies beyond Vox range. Others believe they speak in scent or in light, or not at all. Yet coordination between squads is flawless. Formations adapt mid-strike. Target prioritization shifts with inhuman precision. It is as though each warrior already knows the outcome before the enemy moves. When one falls, no retreat is sounded, no pause. The others adapt, not with grief, with consequence. Among the few who have survived contact with them is a tech priest Dominus named Virek Sel, who served on Raukos during a demonic resurgence quelled by the Guard. Virek described their arrival as a break in the sequence of causality. No Thunderhawks, no orbital telemetry, just a sudden mass displacement at the edge of a firestorm, and then they were there, already advancing, weapons firing in sync, each step silent on Auspex. When Virek approached their formation with standard identification protocols, the Vox returned only one signal, a burst of raw binary that resolved into a single glyph, a tear-shaped wound with no center. The Mechanicus could not translate it, but Virek recognized it from forbidden archives. It was a symbol etched into the blade of Zephon's warglaive, recovered and sealed after the Webway campaigns. The file was classified Omega Priority and sealed under sigillite protocols. No further attempts at contact were made. What passed between the Charnel Guard and the Martian priesthood remains speculative. But after Raukos, the Forge World ceased attempts to interface with them. No weapon requisitions were issued. No gene seed audits were requested. Mars looked away. The Guard did not. They moved from world to world, campaign to campaign, never predicted, never announced. They fought alongside no one, but appeared wherever silence had already begun to fall. Worlds where no prayers were answered, where Vox silence lingered despite system integrity, where memorials collapsed under their own weight. This became known unofficially as the wound pattern. Planets marked by inexplicable precursors to collapse, faint atmospheric shifts, discoloration of local star readings, dreams among psychers of red angels without wings. On such worlds, the Guard would arrive, end the incursion, and vanish before orbital reinforcements arrived. No records were kept, but survivors sometimes spoke of a figure they saw walking at the center of the Guard's advance. Not taller, not brighter, just still, unmoving when others moved, moving when others fell. He did not speak, he did not command. He simply advanced, and others shaped around him. They gave him no name, but when asked what they saw, they all used the same word: grief, not as sorrow, as presence. That word began to appear in graffiti, in vox static, in digital bleed from corrupted astropathic signals. Entire sectors began reporting anomalies, scripts appearing unbidden in cogitator logs, pict feeds shifting into broken images of red-armored figures with faces blurred by static. No hostility, just watching. Imperial scholars dismissed these as contagions, mimetic echoes of trauma. The Mechanicus blamed corrupted wetware. The Inquisition quietly updated their containment protocols. But the Astartes began to take notice. A flesh-tearer's strike force, deployed on Mortis Hex, reported being outflanked and nearly overwhelmed by a hive cult uprising, when ghosts in unpainted power armor cut through the opposition from the rear, never addressing the tearers, never signaling, never remaining in frame long enough to confirm origin. The chapter master of the flesh tearers did not file protest. He filed silence. And in the Librarium of Baal, among the fractured data crystals that no longer align with known chapter formatting, one entry appears, unclaimed. Some wounds do not close, some are not meant to. No attribution, no date. Only one metadata marker remains intact, ZEPH000. It is not a name, but in the language of the Charnel Guard, it is all that remains. A wound given form, a silence made flesh. Before the heresy, there were hosts, not just squads or companies, but processional hierarchies within the 9th Legion, formations built not only for war, but for beauty. The High Host was one such formation. Its members were artists of death, warriors selected not just for skill, but for aesthetic resonance. They bore plumes sculpted like falling ash, armor etched with sub-harmonic refrains only audible in the upper void. Each kill was a performance, each campaign, a gallery. Zephon was their Exarch. He was not the strongest, not the fastest, but he had the rarest trait among the 9th. He could sculpt not with tool or brush, but with war itself. When he fought, others saw shapes in the blood, arcs of motion that told stories beyond language. His blade did not simply kill, it conducted, a ballet of entropy. In this, Sanguinius saw reflection, and elevated Zephon accordingly. The High Host died on Saramanth, not all at once, not in a noble stand. They died in pieces across a war that refused to become legend. Betrayal followed by Xenos entrapment, friendly fire, orders delivered too late. It was there that Zephon was broken, carved open by a blade that knew his blood better than his gene seed did. Not all wounds kill. Some simply remove the future. When he was lifted from the ash field, his hands were gone. His voice was failing. His wings, ceramite and sacred, had been torn from his back and melted into slag. The High Host left no record behind, but one vault endured. It is not known who preserved it. Perhaps it was Meros, the Red. Perhaps it was a silent tech thrall who remembered their passage. But buried deep beneath the storm zones of Baal Prime lies a vault sealed not by command, but by design, coded only to harmonic signatures once known to the host. When rediscovered in the later years of the Indomitus Crusade, it was almost dismissed as an acoustic anomaly. But inside were records not of victories, but of failures. The last words of the High Host were preserved not in language, but in gesture, sculptures of half-formed oaths, picked feeds of warriors hesitating in the moment before death, audio logs of missed strikes, of deaths not sung. These were the truths they had hidden from the 9th. that they too had fallen into despair, that they too had questioned why the angels bled for men who could not even remember their names. At the center of the archive is one fragment. A memory loop, unmarked, corrupted, but constant. It plays only 6 seconds. A figure, armored in crimson so dark it appears black, stands before a shattered mirror, staring at its own reflection. The Vox picks up no words, but in the glass, the face is unmistakable, reconstructed, unscarred, a face not worn in decades. Zephon. The file ends there. The guard recovered the archive in silence. No statement, no redistribution. But from that day forward, their recruits began to wear a new sigil, hidden beneath the inner chest plate, a mirror cracked down the center. The librarians of the Blood Angels eventually discovered this deviation. A formal inquiry was opened. But before contact could be made, the entire charnel detachment vanished into warp space without trajectory. No trace remained. No response followed. Only a single glyph was found etched into the transdeck of their launch vessel. Art is what survives the failure to be understood. The phrase does not appear in any Imperial record, but within forbidden fragments of pre-heresy data looms, it is listed as a sculpture inscription, carved once, on bale, beneath a statue that no longer stands. Attributed to a dominion of the Ninth, lost in war, remembered only by silence. Some believe this archive marks the end of Zephon's legacy. But in the shadow realms of the Noctilith Gates, among Ordo Chronos relic traces and temporal drift signals, there is rumor of another transmission, one that defies sequence. A voice, synthetic but burdened with memory, speaking not to an audience, but to a mirror. You did not fail, you were not meant to succeed. The data is unverified, the origin lost. But those who've heard it report the same sensation, not grief, not pain, something colder, recognition, as if the echo has been waiting, as if the sculptor still carves. The final sighting was not recorded in any official capacity. No data slate confirmed it. No pict feed survived. But the story passed, through whisper networks, through broken Vox chains, through the old blood that remembered what it was to weep without reason. It took place on a world whose name was erased before the dust settled. A place once marked for exterminatus, then stayed for reasons no one could explain. Coordinates lost. Purpose unknown. The guard arrived without signal. 3 strike teams, no orbitals, no support. The atmosphere was dense with ionized sorrow, the terrain choked in carcasses of cities that never raised walls. There were no enemies present, only aftermath. No shots fired, no bodies warm. And in the center of the impact basin, a structure stood that did not belong. Not Xenos, not Imperial. Architecture like thought made static. Geometry that refused to collapse into comprehension. The guards surrounded it. And at the forefront, he walked. The bringer, not named, not hailed, not confirmed, but all present knew. There was no entry recorded, no breach, no forced passage. The figure simply stepped forward and was gone, and with him, the silence broke, not into sound, but into stillness. For 7 hours, the guard remained motionless, weapons sheathed. Motionless, but not inert, like statues mourning an architect that never claimed their work. Then they left. No extraction signaled, no debris left behind. The structure was gone. Only the basin remained. Empty, except for a wound carved into the rock. Not wide, not deep, just deliberate. A single line, too shallow for a trench, too long for a mark. A wound that did not bleed. After that, the guards ceased deployments. Their fortress monastery, once faintly trackable by the eddies it cast in warp current, became unreadable. Search parties dispatched by the Ordo Astartes returned with nothing, either claiming the coordinates led to dead systems, or that nothing had ever been there to begin with. The Administratum declared them lost. The Mechanicus closed their logs. The Inquisition reclassified their origin files as null entities, placeholders in a schema that no longer fit the galaxy's shape. And among the sons of Sanguinius, the silence became tradition. When asked of the Charnel Guard, no chapter speaks. Not the angels in Carmine, not the flesh-tearers, not even the blood angels themselves, not in battle, not in council, not in memory. It is said that the chief librarian of Baal once kept a sculpture in his private vault, small, crude, forged of stone not native to the system. It bore no face, only a smear, like something erased itself before it could be known. Visitors to the vault were asked never to speak of it, and they didn't. Because sometimes, silence is a tribute, not fear, not reverence, just the last shape a name can take before it vanishes completely. Among the few texts that remain, one phrase recurs, not in low Gothic, not in script, but in carved relay, a transmission through broken metal and broken men. The bringer of sorrow never spoke again. Not because he could not, because there was nothing left to say. Because his voice had already been heard. Because silence was the only answer that fit the question no one dared ask. And because some echoes aren't meant to return, they are meant to last.